Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. The January 6th committee is set to hold its 7th public hearing today, and the focus is set to be on the right-wing extremist groups at the Capitol, and of course the role that Donald Trump played in almost providing a siren call to come to Washington for the big rally that incited some of the violence that occurred on January 6th, the Capitol siege. We have been covering this story for you very closely here on Live Now from Fox. And I do want to welcome in our very special guest, Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Elizabeth, welcome into the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox. And I guess the first question is, today's focus is set to be on these extremist groups. So what are you anticipating that the public will hear?
Absolutely. So today, the focus is going to be on the ways in which the White House and the Trump inner circle connected with extremist right-wing militia groups that were intent on coming to the Capitol and causing mayhem and violence in an attempt to overthrow the 2020 election, to thwart the will of the people, which had already been made clear at that point that they wanted Joseph Biden to be the next president of the United States and not Donald Trump. And so what we're going to hear today were expected, although the witnesses have not been named by the committee for security concerns. We're expecting to hear from a very senior member of the Oath Keepers, one of those far-right extremist groups. Jason Van Tatenhove is the person who his name has been circulated, and there could be others. But because of the security reasons, and when you look at that video and see the weaponry and the violence with which these groups react, it's not really surprising that they're keeping those witnesses under wraps for security reasons.
No, it certainly is not surprising, and probably for the safety, absolutely, of these individuals. As we do look ahead and look not only ahead, but also behind to what has occurred since the Capitol riot took place, some of these leaders of these right-wing extremist groups have already faced charges. What are some of those charges that these individuals have already been slapped with?
Yes, absolutely. So there have been charges, including the very extreme charge of seditious conspiracy against members of these groups, including the Proud Boys, for example, including their leader. And seditious conspiracy is a very serious charge that alleges that the person joined with others to overthrow the United States government or interfere with United States law. And the allegation, of course, is that on that day, on January 6th, and in the months surrounding that day, there was a plan to stop the peaceful transfer of power as laid out in our United States Constitution. And so what we're seeing with these charges in courts is the government is saying we've got the goods to back up these charges. And what we're seeing with the January 6th committee hearing is that they are presenting to the United States people their case. And I think you look at that video and then you hear the testimony that shows that this wasn't a one-day thing. It was a well-planned, thought out, fundraised and paid for, complicated attempt to stop the United States from doing what it has done throughout its history, which is respecting the voice of the people, peacefully transferring the power to the next administration that has been elected.
Right, and let's talk about some of that planning, because a tweet that the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, sent out is really come into focus here, because many allege that this tweet actually incited perhaps some of these groups to go into that planning mode. Can you walk us through what this tweet said and why it has essentially taken center stage, especially today when the focus is going to be on these right-wing extremist groups?
Yes. So then President Trump tweeted out after the counting of electoral votes, when we were in this period leading up to January 6th, that if they came on January 6th, there was going to be a quote, wild, it was going to be wild. And I think what we're going to hear a lot about today is what was going on and what the Trump team and Trump himself knew about what these extremist groups were planning and how they were paying attention to his words, how they were being inspired by Trump's words, and how they understood that call that he made over Twitter as really a call to arms, a call to action. And so when you take his public statements, including that, it's going to be a wild tweet, with what I assume we're going to hear today about what they knew these extremist groups were up to, possibly including their potential plans for violence and being armed, then we're going to see those words take on new meaning, I believe, based on what we're going to see today.
And speaking of the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, one of his closest allies, his strategist, Steve Bannon, was actually subpoenaed for not appearing and testifying. But now, in a big reversal, he has announced just days ago that he is now willing to testify. Can you walk us through kind of what has happened here and why you think that there's been this 360 turn of his opinion now to indeed testify?
I mean, I think the change is because he's just about to face the music in court for criminal contempt for failing to comply with the committee's initial subpoena. So the committee asked him to participate. Then when he wouldn't participate willingly, they put out a subpoena. And then when he wouldn't comply with the subpoena, they referred him for criminal prosecution to the Department of Justice, which indicted him on criminal contempt. And they are in court this week. And clearly this is a last-ditch attempt to try to get out of criminal consequences, but it actually doesn't really have any bearing on that prior criminal indictment. But I think the real point here is that, Steve Bannon had not been a member of the White House team for a long time by the time January 6th rolled around. There's no reason why anything he discussed with the president would be subject to executive privilege because he wasn't a member of his White House team. It's not even clear Donald Trump actually said he couldn't testify because of executive privilege. And even if he did say that, as the court proceedings and other aspects of this committee process have shown, President Trump doesn't have blanket executive privilege over this information because it generally sits with the current president. President Biden has said he is not going to issue executive privilege over this information related to January 6th. So the whole thing is just kind of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, and that's why it's been so confusing to follow all of these ins and outs, because just as you outlined it, it doesn't really all make sense. Back to Steve Bannon.
If you're confused, it's understandable because it's confusing because it's all made up. So totally understandable.
Elizabeth, thank you for walking us through that. Back to Steve Bannon, what kind of insight could he provide? Why is his testimony so key and been even such a focal point here? Why are we even talking about Steve Bannon and the insight that he has for our audience that perhaps hasn't been following this story since the beginning?
Well, I think Steve Bannon could potentially be an important link to these outside groups because obviously he spoke to this type of audience. And he also spoke to the president. So it could be an important link from the Trump team to these extremist groups that were prepared for violence, were prepared to reverse the will of the people from the 2020 election through violence, as we've seen in these harrowing videos. But I think in addition to Steve Bannon, what we will likely see today is some of the taped deposition testimony of Pat Cipollone, who was the White House counsel at this time. And he will give us key insights, I'm expecting, into what President Trump knew, what they were doing around the time of January 6th, and potentially key to any criminal referrals or charges later, what Trump's state of mind was regarding this period and whether he knew that what they were doing was unlawful.
Right, and these are just some of the many questions that we have and that we're hoping to get answers from in these public hearings. As we do look ahead, and like you said, and like we've been saying throughout the morning, this is the 7th hearing. There was supposed to be another one scheduled for Thursday, actually, Elizabeth, but that one has been postponed. Not the first time that we've seen some scheduling changes. What are you expecting us to see from here moving forward? And when could our audience potentially kind of aim for this, all of these hearings essentially to be over, for those closing arguments to be made?
Well, it's really interesting in some ways because of the success of the January 6th committee hearings and the compelling narrative that they are laying out for the American people. there have been more and more people coming forward, like just Pat Cipollone just sat for his deposition last Friday, his taped deposition. And so, you know, they are working in real time to take in this avalanche of evidence. They've already spent about a year painstakingly with their bipartisan team going through all the evidence, interviewing people. But what we're seeing is that more people are coming forward being willing to testify to these key and crucial events. And so they're kind of thinking on their feet. And I think that's what we're seeing with some of these postponements and delays. Also, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there are very real security concerns for the witnesses. But I think what we're likely to see is, maybe one or two more hearings. They've said before they're not totally opposed to going into August, but I would imagine that, we'll maybe see something again next week. But what I think is really interesting is, we saw another statement from Trump this morning on his own social media channel, again saying that the election was rigged. And so in some ways, Trump is making their case for them that this is an ongoing threat. This wasn't something that was a one and done January 6th day. This is an ongoing threat to democracy. That's the story that they've been putting out there, and that January 6th was the culmination of some of these conspiracies that we've seen so far, but that more could be coming. And Trump is really just playing into their hands with his statement this morning, again, repeating these lies about the election being rigged, which, as we've seen in these hearings, he and his team all knew was not true.
Right, and essentially the lies that did cause this entire Capitol riot, the insurrection, to occur. Elizabeth Wydra, thank you so much for the time and for the insight, breaking down what has become a very complex situation. I'm sure we'll be touching base as the hearings do continue, and certainly as we look ahead to those closing arguments. Thank you again for the time, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks, you too.